Okay, let me get everybody to turn over to Genesis chapter 37. Genesis chapter 37. And we are going to be going off the notes this morning, as we typically do. And by the way, just as a mental, just sort of as something to be aware of. Genesis, when you're reading through Genesis, sometimes we break up the chapters, or the chapters are broken up in the middle of an event. And Genesis 43, 44, and 45 is really one story. It's to be read as one block. Now, we're breaking it up into three chapters and 3 Sundays, but really, if you were sitting down and reading it, you would read it as one unit. So when we finish Genesis 44, we're going to end it on a high note, sort of as at a climax in the story. And I was really tempted. I was so tempted in this section to just go ahead and cover part of Genesis 45 because of Joseph's response. But, it just got to be such a large block of material, and I, like to, yak, so I figured I'd go ahead and keep it within the time frame or the limits of the chapter. But just to give us a little background, if you go over to Genesis 37, now what we've looked at when we're looking at Genesis 44 is we have Joseph, who has been in Egypt now for more than 20 years. Remember, when Joseph was 17, he was sold into slavery by his brothers, who were jealous of him and betrayed him. They originally wanted to kill him, but they were jealous of him and they betrayed him and they sold him into slavery. And he was taken down to Egypt, where he was sold to Potiphar's house, where he was faithful. And remember, the Lord had blessed Potiphar's house. And what happened there was that eventually he was falsely accused of sexual misconduct, of rape, for which he was put in prison for several years. But the Lord blessed him there. And then the Lord created a scenario in which the Lord gave Pharaoh a dream, a divinely induced dream that nobody could interpret except for one man, and that was Joseph. And all of this was being orchestrated providentially, and that's been our key word that we've been talking about lately, is the doctrine of providence. That God controls the circumstances and the lives of people to control history and the flow of history. Because God is taking history somewhere. God controls the events of history in order to bring about His promises and to fulfill His word to His people. And we saw back in Genesis chapter 15, verse 13, where God had made a promise to Abraham, remember, that his descendants would be enslaved in a land that was not theirs for 400 years. And so in that promise, God had to orchestrate the events to get the descendants of Abraham down into Egypt. And what we found out through the dream that God gave to Pharaoh, that Joseph interpreted, was that God was going to cause a famine to come upon the land. He was going to cause a famine. Now, He was going to give 7 years of prosperity, followed by 7 years of a famine. And it was during the time of the famine that Jacob and his family were going to begin to encounter hunger pains. And so they were going to be forced circumstantially to come down to Egypt. And so God, by controlling circumstances, is able to control people and thus accomplish and fulfill His word. And so what we have now is we have already Jacob's sons, Joseph's brothers, have already come down to Egypt once. They've already come to Egypt once. And so Joseph has already seen his brothers, but by now Joseph has been elevated to the number 2 man position in Egypt. Joseph has been elevated from prisoner, right, to now being a royal official. He has a position of authority in the land of Egypt. But what he's doing is he's testing his brothers. He's testing them. He's testing them to see if they are the same brothers he knew 20 years earlier that were still jealous and if they were still hateful. He's testing them. Now, when we look back at Genesis 37:3, we get the early picture that Joseph had of them before this encounter. Because after this encounter, Joseph doesn't see them. He doesn't see them for 20 years. So when all of a sudden they show up on his doorstep, this is all Joseph has to remember about them. This is what he remembers about them. Now in Genesis 37, verse 3, it says, "Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his sons, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a varicolored tunic." Verse 4, "His brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, and they hated him and could not speak to him on friendly terms." So his brothers hate him because of the favoritism that Jacob shows to his one son over the others. Now down in verse 11 it says, "His brothers were jealous of him." And so you get a glimpse here of what's going on in their hearts, the sin that they're guilty of, the mental attitude sin of jealousy. But this leads them to want to kill him. This is how despicable of a mental attitude sin this is. In verse 18, when Joseph is sent out by his father to go find his brothers and to check on them and to give a report, it says in verse 18, "When they saw him from a distance and before he came close," that is, Jacob's brothers saw him and before Joseph got close, "they plotted against him to put him to death." So not only were they jealous of him, but they were ready to kill him. And then down in verse 26, of course, Reuben intervenes. We know the story. We've been through it. Reuben intervenes and says, "Don't kill them. Don't kill him. Just put him in this pit." But then down in verse 26 it says, "And Judah." Now I want you to catch that because Judah's about to play an important role here in Genesis 44. It says, "And Judah said to his brothers, 'What profit is it for us to kill our brother and to cover up his blood? Come and let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh and blood, our own flesh, and his brothers listen to him.'" So now we have this mental attitude sin of jealousy, okay, because Joseph is shown favoritism by his father, but we also have this betrayal, where they are ready to kill him, and as a last resort they don't do it, but they are willing to sell their brother into slavery. Now that's pretty poor behavior, wouldn't you say? Now what we noticed when we saw Genesis 43 was Joseph had set up his brothers. He had accused them previously of stealing. But when they come to him and they're in his house, remember what he does. He sets up a test in which he sets them all up at a table in front of him, and he's going to test them regarding their jealousy. Remember over in Genesis 43, when we look over in verse 43:33, it says, "Now they were seated before him, the firstborn according to his birthright, and the youngest," this would be Benjamin, "according to his youth. And the men looked at one another in astonishment, and he took portions to them from his own table, but Benjamin's portion was 5 times as much as theirs." Now what's the test here? Here's all the brothers lined up. And here's Benjamin, Joseph's full brother. And the test is this: will Joseph's brothers be jealous of Benjamin because he gets 5 times as much, because Benjamin is here shown favoritism? Will his brothers be jealous of Benjamin? They were towards him. And that's the test. And it says here, "So they feasted and drank freely with him." So it appears from this verse here that Joseph's brothers had matured. That the sin of jealousy was something that no longer was part of their mental attitude. And they could live with their brother getting 5 times the portion of food that they got, being shown favoritism, and they were okay with it. So they passed test number 1. What we're getting into in Genesis 44 is test number 2. And I'll let you know up front, it's a test of whether or not they will betray Benjamin. It's a test of whether or not they will sell their brother for their own safety, for their own well-being. And this is the test. So let me read this opening quote I have here from Dr. Alan P. Ross, and then we'll get into the text. Dr. Ross says, "One more test was necessary before Joseph could disclose himself to his brothers and move his family to Egypt. Joseph had to see if they would abandon Rachel's other son, the favored Benjamin, if it should come to their life or his." Now looking at Genesis 44 verse 1, it says then. Now then gives us the time, and this would be after the dinner. After the dinner that they had, they enjoyed together in Genesis 43. So the story picks right up. They had just finished dinner, enjoying this meal. It says, then he commanded his house steward, saying, fill the men's sacks with food, as much as they can carry, because they're going to carry it back to the land of Canaan, and put each man's money in the mouth of his sack. And this was as he had done before. But now he tells the steward, he says, put my cup, the silver cup, that is the one that Joseph was accustomed to drinking out of, in the mouth of the sack of the youngest. That would be Benjamin. And his money for the grain. Now all of this is a setup. Joseph is setting up his brothers, and he has this silver cup that he's used to drinking out of, and he has it put in Benjamin's sack. And it says, and he did as Joseph had told him. As soon as it was light, that is the next morning, the men were sent away, they with their donkeys. Verse 4. Now they had just gone out of the city and were not far off, when Joseph said to his house steward, up, follow the men, and when you overtake them, say to them, why have you repaid evil for good? So immediately upon approaching them, he's going to accuse them of something wrong. He's going to accuse them of doing something evil. Now these men probably feel like they've been on an emotional roller coaster because they can't quite figure Joseph out. Now they don't know it's Joseph. See, this is all part of the whole dynamic of the story. They don't know that this is Joseph. They think their brother's dead. They've sold Joseph into slavery. They're assuming he's dead. They don't know who this guy is. He's just some political Egyptian official. And they've been accused of being spies, which was a crime punishable by death. Then all of a sudden they're treated kindly, and now all of a sudden they're being accused of evil. They're probably feeling sort of emotionally just up and down. And so now they're going to be accused of repaying evil for good. And the accusation is this not the one that is the cup from which my Lord drinks, and which indeed he uses for divination? Now divination was a custom that was practiced by the Egyptians. Now Joseph did not practice divination, but this is all in keeping with the charade. This is all in keeping with his disguise as a political Egyptian official. And he says, you have done wrong in doing this. Verse 6, so he overtook them and spoke these words to them. Now they must have been caught off guard because they thought everything was hunky-dory. I mean, they've got their food in their sacks, they're traveling out, they just had a good meal, a good night's sleep. By the way, Simeon had been in jail for a while, probably a few months. He just got out, he's probably enjoying his freedom, he's feeling good. Verse 7 says, then they said to him, why does my Lord speak such words as these? Far be it from your servants to do such a thing. Now obviously they're concerned over the charge. They're feeling innocent. They've done no wrong. They know that they're innocent. He says, behold, the money which we found in the mouth of our sacks, we have brought back to you from the land of Canaan. How could we steal silver or gold from your Lord's house? In other words, their whole argument is based on their past actions. In other words, their past actions don't fit the current charge. And this is what they're arguing. And he says in verse 9, now this is where they open mouth, insert foot. He says, with whomever your servants is found, let him die. Uh-oh. Now look, you don't want to give that sort of self-pronounced judgment. You know what I'm saying? He says, with whomever your servants is found, let him die. And we, that is the rest of the brothers, will be my Lord's slaves. So in other words, what they're saying is, look, if we're guilty of this thing, then let the man who has the cup, let him be put to death, and the rest of us will all become your slaves. Now, you can kind of understand why they would maybe be quick to say this sort of thing in one sense, because if you're innocent, what do you have to fear? You know? But in their rashness, they threw out this statement. Now the servant, fortunately, doesn't really go with their words. Verse 10, so he, and this would be the servant, said, now let it also be according to your words. He, not they, he with whom it is found shall be my slave. So only the penalty of slavery would be executed on the one who had the cup. So this was what the servant said. So in other words, he really rejects their charge. Okay? and says, no, we're not going to put him to death. We're not going to enslave all of you. It's just going to be slavery just for the one who has the cup. And the rest of you shall be innocent. Verse 11. Then they hurried, each man lowered his sack to the ground, and each man opened his sack. And so you can picture these brothers one at a time just, yanking these things off their donkeys real quick and, opening his sack. Verse 12, he searched beginning with the oldest and ending with the youngest, and the cup was found in Benjamin's sack. Now don't you know their hearts just sank when he pulled that cup out, and they all just, their jaws just whoop-kadoosh, just hit the ground, They all just, in uniform, just whoop-kadoosh. Verse 13, they tore their clothes, which was an expression in that day. Just today we'd say they all found their favorite expletive and uniformly pronounced it. But they tore their clothes when each man loaded, and when each man loaded his donkey, they returned to the city. So they left in the morning, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, with a hop and a skip in their step, and now they're coming back with their heads hung low and dark clouds over top, and they're probably feeling pretty bad right now. So they return to the city, and it's a dark day. And when Judah and his brothers came to Joseph's house, he was still there, and they fell to the ground before him. Now remember, we've seen this several times, because remember back in Genesis 37, part of the reason why Joseph's brothers hated him was why? Because of the dream. Remember, Joseph had a dream that was given to him by God that his brothers would bow down before him. And his brothers rose up and said, "What? We're going to bow down to you? That'll never happen." And they hated him because of his dreams. And yet, in their ignorant state here, what are they doing? They're fulfilling this prophetic word of the Lord, aren't they? They're bowing down. And this isn't the first time. They've actually done it several times. So they're unwittingly fulfilling the word of the Lord here. Verse 15, and Joseph said to them, "What is this deed you have done? Do you not know that such a man as I can indeed practice divination?" So again, he's continuing the charade. And in his words, you get the idea that he's claiming that he knew about the cup through a supernatural ability, which really must have kind of spooked him, because it's like, man, he knew one of us had the cup, how do you know? How do you see inside of things? I see purses out here, but I don't know what's in there. But for me to name the contents, kind of spooky. So verse 16, so Judah said, now catch this is Judah. Now all the brothers are here. And Judah's not the oldest. And you would expect the firstborn to be the one to step up and start to talk for the brothers. But who's the one who's stepping up here? Judah. And who is the one who betrayed Joseph? Judah. Verse 14, so when Judah and his brothers came to the house, he was still there and fell to the ground before him. Oh, wait, let me pick up. Verse 16, so Judah said, "What can we say to my Lord? What can we speak? And how can we justify ourselves? God has found out the iniquity of your servants." Now what iniquity? What's he thinking back on? Do you think Judah is thinking back perhaps to what happened between him and Joseph 20 years earlier? I think there's some guilt here in his words. And the fact that he brings God into it. He's standing here before Pharaoh, but he brings God into the whole thing. And this must have been refreshing to Joseph to hear this, because here his brothers are now beginning to think divine viewpoint, which is that factoring of God into all of life. Nothing happens by chance. And Judah now stands here before what he thinks is just this Egyptian politician, and he's interpreting these events in such a way that he's factoring God into what's going on. And he's thinking about God in his current context, in his situation of what's going on. And that must have refreshed the heart of Joseph. His heart must have just skipped a beat. And he says something here. He says, "Behold, we," not Benjamin, "we are my Lord's slaves." We are my Lord's slaves. Notice that plural there. He's not selling his brother out, is he? I mean, he could have. He could have said, oh yeah, he's the one. And your servant said that whoever the one is, let him be the slave, and the rest of you are innocent and can go free. That's what he said. Isn't that, servant? Over here. You said it. Testimony. He's guilty. We're going to go free. He could have done that, couldn't he? But he doesn't do that. Behold, we are my Lord's slaves, both we and the one in whose possession the cup has been found. So Judah now announces that the family is going to function as a what? A unit. He's basically showing them as a unit. But Joseph is going to give him an out here. He says, but he said, far be it from me to do this. He's rejecting Judah's offer. The man in whose possession the cup has been found, he shall be my slave. But as for you, go in peace to your father. So there's the test. He's going to drive the wedge. He's going to say, no, I'm not accepting your offer. We'll accept him as a slave. The rest of you, go. Go back home. So Joseph puts the test to them, and he drives the wedge. He attempts to drive the wedge between Benjamin and his brothers. And that's the test. And the test would be to see if the brothers would save themselves at Benjamin's expense. Then Judah does something that is absolutely marvelous. In this speech that he gives, it is absolutely marvelous. Then Judah approached him and said, and here he's going to advocate for Benjamin, "O my Lord, may your servant please speak a word in my Lord's ears. And do not be angry with your servant, for you are equal to Pharaoh." Respectful language. And now Judah is going to recount, he's going to give information that Joseph knew. But in Judah's words, at a certain point, he's going to share information with Joseph that Joseph didn't know. He's going to give Joseph information that he didn't know. But first he's going to tell him what Joseph did know. And here's what he says that Joseph already knew. Verse 19, "My Lord asked his servants," this was at their first encounter, saying, "Have you a father or a brother?" And we said to my Lord, "We have an old father and a little child of his old age." Now his brother is dead, assuming. Of course he's not dead. Where is he? Standing right in front of him, right? So he alone is left of his mother, and this is Rachel, and his father loves him. His father loves him. So Judah is correctly assessing the situation. Not that it's right, not that Jacob is showing favoritism towards Benjamin is right, but Judah at least perceives the situation correctly. And he's going to not only accept it, but he's going to show compassion towards Jacob. Verse 21. "Then you said to your servants, 'Bring him down to me, that I may set my eyes on him.' But we said to my Lord, 'The lad cannot leave his father, for if he should leave his father would die.' And you said to your servants, 'However, unless your youngest brother comes down with you, you will not see my face again.'" Now Joseph knew this. Joseph recalls this situation. But now Judah tells Joseph something that Joseph didn't know. Because when Judah and his brothers went back to the land of Canaan, remember they were there for a period of time until the grain was gone. And now they had this interaction, they had this discourse, and then they came back down. And so now Judah is going to share information that Joseph is hearing for the first time. And it's going to help him in his evaluation of his brothers. It's going to give them a glimpse into their heart. And he says in verse 24, he says, "Thus it came about, when we went up to your servant, my father, we told him the words of my Lord. And our father said, 'Go back, buy us a little food.' But we said, 'We cannot go down. If our younger brother is with us, then we will go down, for we cannot see the man's face unless our youngest brother is with us.' And your servant, my father, said to us, 'You know that my wife bore me 2 sons.'" This would be Rachel. "And the one went out from me, and I said, 'Surely he is torn in pieces.' And I have not seen him since." You see, Joseph didn't know. that Jacob thought that his son had been torn to pieces by a wild lion? Joseph is hearing this for the first time. Verse 29, if you take this one also from me and harm befalls him, you will bring my gray hair down to Sheol in sorrow. Now therefore, when I come to your servant my father, and the lad is not with us, since his life is bound up in the lad's life, when he sees that the lad is not with us, he will die. Now it's interesting, the phrase there when it says, since his life is bound up, bound up. The Hebrew word there is kashar. And it means to bind, to join, or to knit together, like fabric that is knitted together. And one can almost imagine the nature of their relationship is such that they have so grown together. It is like fabric that has been knitted together. And to so tear them apart is to like rip fabric apart. To destroy that which has been beautifully woven together. And he said, since his life is literally knitted together in the lad's life, recognizing Jacob's special bond with Benjamin here. And by the way, he's not showing jealousy as he had done with Joseph. And this is what's so fabulous about Jacob's statement here. He says, when he sees that the lad is not with us, he will die. And Judah's words here are such compassionate words towards his father, which he had not shown before. He was willing to lie and deceive his father and kill an animal and take the garment and rub it in the animal's blood and say, oh, we found this, Papa. When it was deception and a lie, and they ripped their father's heart out that day. And now they know that if something happens to Benjamin, that their father will die from grief. Now, if you love someone, then you know what it is to have your soul knitted together with somebody in such a way that to lose them is to have somebody ripped from your life. You know what I'm talking about? A son, a daughter, a spouse, a parent, sometimes even a friend. And when he sees that the lad is not with us, he will die. And thus your servants will bring the gray hair of your servant, our father, down to Sheol in sorrow. For your servant became surety for the lad to my father, thus promising to protect Benjamin's life, saying, if I do not bring him back to you, then let me bear the blame before my father forever. Now therefore please, and you can almost pick up the pleading in his words here. Now therefore please let your servant remain instead of the lad, a slave to my Lord. What's he offering? Himself. He is offering to be a substitute for his brother. The one who has been charged guilty of the crime. He's saying, look, because of my love for my father, let me come as a substitute for my brother. Let me suffer in his place. Let him go. Substitutionary love. That's great. That you would die or suffer in the place of another for their well-being. Now therefore please let your servant remain instead of the lad as a slave to my Lord, and let the lad go up with his brothers. For how shall I go up to my father if the lad is not with me, for fear that I see the evil that would overtake my father? So Judah here shows compassion not only towards Benjamin and responsibility, but he shows compassion towards his father. Now you compare that with the section that we read in Genesis 37 about Judah. That he was jealous towards his brother and that he was ready to kill him and then sell him into slavery. And the words of what we read of Judah here, that's a different man. Judah has changed. Judah has changed. And this happens to us, doesn't it? Because the people I stare at today in front of me, you're different. You're not the person you were 6 months ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Right? I mean, hopefully we are growing more and more and more into the character of Christ. And hopefully those values that we had rooted in us, that when we were locked into the value system of the world, are slowly being taken away from us as we are being conformed into the character of Christ. And when we look at the life of Judah here, and we look at his words, man, we just want to stand up and just applaud. I mean, I read this and I was just like, wow, that's a different Judah. And you can imagine Joseph. He's sitting here and he's listening to these words. And of course, next week, we're going to see the breakdown. Joseph just can't contain it anymore. He is going to just lose it. He is just going to break down and start crying. I mean, there's just going to be this emotional outburst. The floodgates are going to fly open. And his brothers are going to be looking at each other like, what? You know, we're trying to, convince this guy to let us go, and all of a sudden he breaks down and starts crying, and then all of a sudden they find out it's Joseph. I mean, whoa. I mean, just the whole thing is just going to just hit this high point. And the will of God will be accomplished. Because what they intended for evil originally, God intended for good. Dr. Alan P. Ross, in this last quote I have here, he says, the passage teaches that in order for brothers to live together in unity, they must have self-sacrificing love for one another. But it teaches this lesson by demonstrating that those who have not possessed such love will be called upon to demonstrate it. Judah's speech focuses on this point. For he appealed for Benjamin for his father's sake and willingly offered himself in the place of Benjamin. He did so because he knew that God had found out their past sins and that the present difficulty was part of the retribution. You see, God had gotten into his thinking. And part of that divine viewpoint not only caused him or influenced him to accept responsibility for his past, but influenced him in such a way that he could now show a maturity that he had never shown before in his life. You know, sometimes we fail tests and we need to look at it and recognize, okay, that's a failure, and realize that relapse doesn't mean collapse. You know, that you can step back, but that doesn't mean destruction. You know, that you can pick up and you can confess and you can move on. And we can look at a situation like this where Judah passes the test. And that's what we want too. And we have to look at situations when they crop up in front of us as an opportunity. As an opportunity to grow. As an opportunity to live by faith and to advance in our spiritual life and to trust in the Lord. And to demonstrate love and responsibility and commitment. Right? Christian integrity. A few summary points. The central idea of the text is that Joseph tested his brothers one last time to see if there was love in their hearts for one another, and discovered that they had matured, especially Judah. That must have really must have just meant something personally to him, because Judah was the one who pushed the brothers to betray him. To betray him. Not only to kill him, but to sell him. And here Judah is not only not jealous towards Benjamin, but is willing to advocate for him and to put himself into slavery. And Judah had a wife, remember? Tamar. He had children by her. He was giving up not only his personal freedom, but his family. I mean, there was a great sacrifice here. Point number 2, the difficult test that Joseph placed upon his brothers served to reveal their hearts, manifesting their true characters. Joseph was bursting with love for his brothers, but wanted to know that they had changed and that they were mature enough for a healthy relationship. He wanted to enter into a loving relationship with them, but he wanted to know that they were mature enough to have a healthy relationship. Point number 3. For strength and unity to exist in a family, there must be a bond of commitment and a willingness at times to sacrifice all of oneself for the well-being of others. That must exist. Believers must always guard themselves against the weakening instinct of self-preservation by consciously choosing to live and love sacrificially for the benefit of others. I'll say that again. Believers must always guard themselves against the weakening instinct of self-preservation. Because that was the test. Would they preserve themselves at the sacrifice of their brothers? Now that's true not only in the family, but that's true in every aspect of life. That's true on the job. That's true on the battlefield. That's true in every aspect of life, because we have to guard ourselves against that weakening instinct of self-preservation. And we have to rise above that and have courage, honor, integrity. We have to live by something more than ourselves. And so believers must always guard themselves against the weakening instinct of self-preservation by consciously choosing to live and love sacrificially for the benefit of others. We must be willing to love in such a way that we can sacrifice of ourselves for the edification, for the building up of others. Because that's what the Christian life is about. It's about love.